Chapter 1 of The Violence of Abstraction. Prologue. Marx's guiding thread. Quote, in the social production of their life, men enter into definite relations that are indispensable and independent of their will. Relations of production which correspond to a definite stage of development of their material productive forces. The sum total of these relations of production constitutes the economic structure of society, the real foundation on which rises a legal and political superstructure, and to which correspond definite forms of social consciousness. The mode of production of material life conditions the social, political, and intellectual life process in general. It is not the consciousness of men that determines their being, but on the contrary, their social being that determines their consciousness. At a certain stage of their development, the material productive forces of society come into conflict with the existing relations of production, or what is but a legal expression for the same thing, with the property relations within which they have been at work hitherto. From forms of development of the productive forces, these relations turn into their fetters. Then begins an epoch of social revolution. With the change of the economic foundation, the entire immense superstructure is more or less rapidly transformed. End quote. Marx, Preface to the Critique of Political Economy, 1859. These few lines are amongst the most familiar, but also the most debated, in all Marx. Introduced by a thumbnail sketch of his intellectual development up to the mid-1840s, they summarize in his own words, quote, the general result at which I arrived at, and which, once won, served as a guiding thread for my studies, end quote. The passage comes from the 1859 preface to the Critique of Political Economy, the first part of Marx's, quote, economics to be published. This project, which was to eventuate in 4 volumes of Capital, the summit of his life's work, had already occupied Marx for some 15 years. Under the circumstances, it is impossible to believe that he did not weigh his words carefully. He himself indicates that he wrote the 1859 preface to replace an earlier draft introduction, that of 1857 to the Grundrisse. To be sure, the book had to pass the Prussian censor, and it has been suggested that the language of its preface, the first and perhaps the only thing the censor would be likely to read, is appropriately coded. The word, quote, class, for instance, a concept normally and rightly thought central to Marx's view of history, is conspicuous by its absence. But whilst due allowance might be made for such linguistic caution, there remains no convincing reason not to regard the 1859 preface, as Marxists traditionally have, as providing a definite summary, indeed the nearest Marx ever came in print to the historic summary. Indeed, the nearest Marx ever came in print to the definitive summary of the core of the materialist conception of history. If so, certain conclusions as to what that conception is would seem inexorably to follow. The most lucid and influential recent elaboration can be found in G.A. Cohen's book, Karl Marx's Theory of History, A Defense, 1978. Cohen describes his Marxism as, quote, an old-fashioned historical materialism, a traditional conception in which history is fundamentally the growth of human productive power, and forms of society rise and fall accordingly as they enable or impede that growth. End quote. Cohen. The 1859 preface, which Cohen reproduces at length as the frontispiece to his book, is the, quote, most pregnant statement, end quote, of this version of historical materialism, one which would not have been unfamiliar to Plekhanov or Kautsky. Though occasionally unorthodox in his treatment of some aspects of Marx's concepts, Cohen undoubtedly does articulate the essentials of the traditional conception. He does so, moreover, with a clarity and rigor not always associated with that tradition, which is why I take his formulations as exemplary here. Cohen interprets the claims of the 1859 preface as follows. The text presents, to begin with, a general theory of history. Fundamental to this theory, the bedrock, as it were, on which the, quote, economic foundation of society is built, are material productive forces. But these by the material productive forces, Cohen understands the things people use in order to produce. Productive forces consist of two sorts of things: means of production, raw materials, instruments of production, auxiliary materials, premises, spaces, some scientific knowledge, and labor power. Human beings' physical and mental capacity to work, together with their accumulated skills. Cohen postulates and attributes to Marx an inherent tendency for these forces to develop throughout history, the, quote, development thesis, and argues that in Marx's theory, productive forces have explanatory primacy, in that it is their level of development which explains the production relations of a society, and from time to time obliges them to change the primacy thesis. Development of productive forces is thus for Cohen the fundamental dynamic or motor of history, and Marx's theory of history is ultimately a technological theory of history. Importantly, Cohen insists that productive forces are material, as distinct from social entities. He sees this material-social distinction as a systematic and fundamental one in Marx's work. Whose existence must be acknowledged if the primacy thesis is to be rendered coherent. Production relations for Cohen are relations of ownership between people and productive forces, thus defined. By ownership, Cohen does not mean a legal relationship. This would create problems of circularity, since the base, in quotation marks, comprising production relations would then apparently presuppose its, quote, superstructure, in which legal relations are held to belong. Ownership, as Cohen uses the term, is a relationship of effective control, an ability really to command the force owned. The power may or may not be superstructurally expressed in the form of legal relations. The totality of production relations, thus construed, makes up the, quote, economic structure of society, its base, or, quote, infrastructure, in standard Marxist parlance. This is society's, quote, foundation, that which in Capital's words provides the, quote, innermost secret, the hidden basis of the entire social structure, end quote. In accord with the primacy thesis, bases, quote, correspond to requisite levels of development of material productive forces. In most forms of society, production relations will be class relations, and class, conversely, is, for Cohen, entirely defined as a property relation. Quote, "A person's class is established by nothing but his objective place in the network of ownership relations. His consciousness, culture, and politics do not enter the definition of his class position," end quote. Cohen argues that these exclusions are necessary to protect the substantive character of Marx's claim, that the latter are largely determined by the former. This position receives some support from, amongst others, Perry Anderson in his critique of 1980. This position receives some support from, amongst others, Perry Anderson in his critique of E.P. Thompson, the most prominent recent advocate of a, quote, cultural rather than a, quote, structural, the terms are inadequate, concept of class. Two further consequences of Cohen's definition of the economic base, where he differs somewhat from more traditional and usually less scrupulously formulated Marxist accounts, should be noted. First, for Cohen, productive forces are not themselves part of the economic structure of society. Quote, economic structure of society. If productive forces were part of the, quote, economic structure of society, Cohen argues, we cannot make sense of Marx's claim that productive forces and production relations come into conflict, which would seem to suppose that they are separate entities. The primacy thesis demands their clear demarcation. Second, only relations of ownership in his sense can be bona fide production relations. This means other forms of social relationship which are evidently connected with or have a bearing on material production fall outside the category. These include both relations within the immediate production process itself, like forms of division of labor in the workshop, which Cohen calls, quote, material relations, between producers, and relations which lie apparently out with, but nevertheless facilitate production, like particular forms of law, state, or family. Though Cohen does not deny the productive salience of such relations, he does not count them as relations of production. The economic base is made up of, and only of, property relations as Cohen defines them. This base is the, quote, real foundation on which legal and political, quote, superstructures in turn arise, and to which, quote, definite forms of social consciousness, end quote, correspond. Cohen is similarly punctilious in his definition of the superstructure. Cohen is also on this occasion rather less than orthodox. Marxists who adhere to a base superstructure perspective have usually implicitly taken the superstructure to include all else in society, though there have always been some gray areas, prominent amongst them language. For Cohen, however, the superstructure specifically comprises, quote, non-economic institutions, end quote. Above all, the institutions of law and state. This implies that phenomena may exist in social life which are neither basic nor superstructural, an important limitation on the explanatory pretensions of historical materialism. Additionally, for Cohen, the 1859 preface, quote, "forms of social consciousness," end quote, are not part of the superstructure where, for most Marxists, forms of social consciousness quintessentially belong. Not much hangs on this, however, at least in Cohen's view, since Marx says very similar things about both, namely that they are, quote, "strongly conditioned by the economic base." As productive forces develop, production relations are forced to change. The, quote, "entire immense superstructure," end quote, sooner or later alters accordingly. Marxists have traditionally interpreted such propositions causally, although in most cases with a determined effort not to do so mechanistically. Cohen makes a persuasive philosophical case for the view that if Marxism is to be rendered coherent, correspondence of production relations to productive forces and superstructures to base must be interpreted in functional terms. Functional explanation is thus, in his view, indissociable from historical materialism. He maintains with some justice that Marxists for the most part do treat these relationships functionally, loath as they might be to admit it. So for Cohen, Marxism holds that, quote, "economic structures are as they are because, being so, they enable human productive power to expand," end quote. End quote. Superstructures are as they are because, being so, they consolidate economic structures, end quote. There, in a nutshell, we have Karl Marx's theory of history. It is an economic, indeed, in the final analysis, a largely technological determinism, albeit of a functional rather than a conventionally causal sort. The poverty of philosophy's infamous claim, quote, "the hand mill gives you society with the feudal lord, the steam mill society with the industrial capitalist," end quote, should not be considered the embarrassment 20th century Marxist intellectuals have so often found it. On the contrary, it expresses the very core of Marxist thought. Section 2. Cohen's reading is cogent, and his book undeniably persuasive. In many ways, he cuts through a century of evasion and doublethink, and forces us to think seriously, clearly, and honestly about what are the central and distinctive claims of historical materialism. In so doing, he powerfully restores and lends new philosophical credibility to a certain traditional Marxist, quote, orthodoxy. The Marxists of the Second International, for long the whipping boys of, quote, Western Marxism, stand posthumously vindicated. But there is still room, perhaps, for doubt. Let us begin not with Marx himself, but with a famous series of letters written by another stalwart of the Second International, Marx's lifelong friend and collaborator, Friedrich Engels, in the 1890s. By then, Marx was dead. He died in 1883. But his ideas, often in bastardized forms, were beginning to animate social democratic parties throughout Europe. In these letters, Engels, who was habitually, it might be remembered, more of a popularizer than Marx, showed himself appalled by the crudity with which some of the younger, quote, Marxists of the time were treating Marx's work, and sought to soften the hard economic determinism drawn by them from such texts as the 1859 preface. Marx's references to contemporary Marxists in the early 1880s had been no more flattering, as Engels elsewhere recalls. Cohen's own formulation of the, quote, primacy thesis and, quote, correspondence of superstructure to base, is, as I have noted, functional rather than straightforwardly causally determinist. And these letters of Engels in no way in and of themselves simply refute him. They do, however, suggest an altogether different attitude or approach to Marx's guiding thread, and it is for that reason that I rehearse them here. Engels' best-known revisionist formulations are contained in his letter to Joseph Bloch on the 21st of September, 1890. Here, he qualifies the apparent determinism of Marx's 1859 preface thus, quote, according to the materialist conception of history, the ultimately determining element in history is the production and reproduction of real life. Neither Marx nor I have ever asserted more than this. Therefore, if somebody twists this into saying that the economic factor is the only determining factor, he is transforming that proposition into a meaningless, abstract, absurd phrase. The economic situation is the base, but the various components of the superstructure, political forms of the class struggle and its consequences, such as constitutions drawn up by the victorious class after a successful battle, etc., juridical forms, and even the reflections of all these actual struggles in the minds of the participants, political, juristic, philosophical theories, religious views, and their further development into systems of dogmas, also exercise their influence upon the course of the historical struggles, and in many cases determine their form in particular. There is an interaction of all these elements, in which amid all the endless number of accidents, the economic movement is finally bound to assert itself. Otherwise, the application of the theory to any period of history one choose would be easier than the solution of a simple equation of the first degree. End quote. Engels, 1890. Engels goes on to say that we make our own history, but under definite conditions, amongst which, quote, the economic ones are ultimately decisive, end quote. Engels also offers an image of history as the product of, quote, innumerable cross-cutting forces, an infinite series of parallelograms of forces, end quote. The unplanned resultant of the play of myriad individual wills and actions. If these latter are impelled by, quote, external, in the final analysis, economic circumstances, end quote, they cannot on that account be disregarded, for, quote, each contributes to the resultant and is to this extent included in it, end quote. Other letters say similar things. The letter to Schmidt of the 5th of August 1890 describes people's, quote, material mode of existence as the, quote, primum agens, end quote, but immediately adds that, quote, this does not preclude the ideological sphere from reacting upon it in their turn, though with secondary effect, end quote. Writing again to Schmidt 2 months later, Engels speaks of the, quote, internal relative independence, end quote, of the state and conceives its relations with the economy as, quote, the interaction of two unequal forces, end quote, in which the, quote, retroaction of the state power on economic development can do great damage to the economic development, end quote. Law, likewise, quote, must not only correspond to the general economic condition and be its expression, but must also be an internally coherent expression, end quote. Hence, quote, it rarely happens that a code of law is the blunt, unmitigated, unadulterated expression of the dominance of a class. This in itself would offend the conception of right, end quote. In some, quote, ideological outlook influences in its turn the economic basis and may, within certain limits, modify it, end quote. Speaking of literature and philosophy, Engels, in yet another avatar of the, quote, relative autonomy argument, describes the, quote, ultimate supremacy of economic development, end quote, as in this case operating only, quote, within the terms laid down by the particular sphere itself, end quote. In his letter to Mering of 14th of July, 1893, offers still another formulation, which is in some way at odds with the, quote, inherent relative independence, end quote, model. It is ridiculous, he says that here, to assume that, quote, because we deny an independent historical development to various ideological spheres, we also deny them any effect on history, end quote. Similar arguments are advanced in the letter to Borgias, previously published as to Starkenberg, of the 25th of January, 1894. In this case, it is, quote, economic necessity, which is finally seen as having to assert itself. And Engels introduces one more analogy from the mathematical realm. Quote, the further the particular sphere which we are investigating is removed from the economic sphere and approaches that of a pure abstract ideology, the more shall we find it exhibiting accidents in its development. The more will its curve run zigzag. But if you plot the average axis of the curve, you will find that this axis will run more and more parallel to the axis of economic development, the longer the period considered, and the wider the field dealt with, end quote, Engels. Engels cautions, however, quote, please do not weigh each word in the above too carefully. I have not the time to work out what I am writing to you so exactly as I should be obliged to for publication, end quote. This letter is also of interest in the present context for including within, quote, economic conditions which we regard as the determining base of the history of society, end quote, both geographical circumstances and race, which Engels described as, quote, itself an economic factor, end quote. Unlike Cohen, Engels also includes there, quote, the entire technique of production and transport, end quote. Whatever the difficulties with, or the undoubted possible inconsistencies between these various formulations, the broad outline of what Engels is wanting to say in these letters, his, quote, testament, as some have described it, is crystal clear, and it seems to me at any rate to contradict the spirit of Cohen's, quote, traditional historical materialism, end quote. Not the least interesting feature of these letters, sharply contrasting with Cohen's analytic nicety, is the capaciousness of Engels' notion of, quote, economic sphere and, quote, superstructure. The primum agens, for instance, is variously described as economic situation, movement, circumstances, conditions, development, and necessity, while the superstructure, Engels' quote, ideological spheres, extends well beyond Cohen's institutions of state and law. It may, of course, be argued that notwithstanding his terminological latitude, a lapse of rigor perhaps, understandable in private correspondence, Engels' formulations can be reconciled philosophically with Cohen's version of Marx. Cohen might argue that Engels' remarks, insofar no doubt as they are meaningful at all, bear it best on how the primacy of the economic is conceived as operating, without weakening either the claim of primacy or its functional interpretation one iota. Additionally, Cohen's own functional account of primacy itself entails the feedback of relations on forces and superstructures on bases, since the character of the former term is in each case explained by its functionality for the latter. Quote, construing Marx's explanations as functional makes for compatibility between the causal power of the explained phenomenon and their secondary status in the order of explanation, end quote. Cohen, 1978. Interestingly, however, apart from passing reference to Engels' unexplained determination in the last, quote, determination in the last resort, end quote, Cohen entirely ignores these letters. I think the omission unfortunate. Though Marx and Engels were not identical twins, Engels' testimony ought surely to count for something in the interpretation of the central tenets of Marx's thought. Certainly, nothing Engels says in these late letters in any way denies the centrality to historical materialism of the production and reproduction of real life. Nor will anything said in this book but Engels' caveats should affect how we understand that claim, and he is adamant that this should not be done in what he sees as a simplistic reductionist manner. Claims for primacy, whether of forces or relations, have at least to be nuanced. To do otherwise for Engels is to travesty his and Marx's life work. That Engels returned to the issue on so many occasions is perhaps indicative of how comprehensive and damaging he considered the travesty to be. Section 3. With some exceptions, subsequent Marxists have, for the most part, accepted the ultimate economic determination relative superstructural autonomy framework established by Engels and happily pursued empirical work within this framework without troubling over much about its theoretical credentials. It is, after all, an undogmatic, sensibly flexible basis for a materialist sociology which is sufficiently open to allow room for the real complexity of history. A not unreasonable, quote, guiding thread. But from the 1960s onward, there have been various attempts to develop what Althusser once somewhat patronizingly called Engels', quote, genial theoretical intuitions, end quote, in conceptually more, quote, rigorous ways. Althusser himself has advanced an elaborate model of, quote, structural causality, in which society is conceived as being made up of a, quote, structure in dominance, comprising several distinct, quote, levels or, quote, instances, economy, polity, ideology, and so forth, any one of which may play the, quote, dominant role in a, quote, given conjuncture, but whose overall interrelation is governed by economic factors. Poulantzas, in his earlier writings, offered a similar schema. Godelier, by contrast, hypothesizes a functional hierarchy in which relations of production dominate social structures under all conditions, but which social relations actually constitute production relations in a given context, but which social relations actually constitute production relations in a given context may vary enormously. Frequently, these will not be manifestly, quote, economic relations at all. He counts kinship relations as relations of production in many primitive societies, as does Meillassoux age and gender relations. Meillassoux is a Marxist anthropologist, I'm pretty sure, from France. I think he's an anthropologist. He's the father of that new philosopher, I believe, who's like the new materialism guy. Anyway, Rodney Hilton has recently argued a similar case for juridical relations in feudal Europe. Hindis and Hurst, at one stage in their odyssey of critique and autocritique, tried to conceptualize superstructures as essential, but non-economic conditions of existence of economic bases. I could continue. For Cohen, these are in the end little more than obfuscations and evasions. On one level, I am inclined to agree, at least so far as the theoretical contortions of Althusser and his followers are concerned. Such conceptual acrobatics recall the equants and epicycles of Ptolemaic astronomy in the face of the Copernican challenge, attempts frantically to buttress an outmoded theory in the face of anomalous phenomenon. But I wish to argue against going down this road of ever more elaborate theoretical schemata. I think that the problems to which it is a response, in many cases, those of applying traditional Marxist categories, like Cohen's, to the analysis of non-capitalist societies, are real enough, and much that is illuminating has been unearthed in the attempt. In particular, Marxist historians and anthropologists' realization of the need to extend the category of relations of production beyond its traditional, quote, economic boundaries is a step forward. I shall return to this in later chapters, but for the moment I want to draw a rather different set of emphases from Engels' quote, testament. These points tell equally against, quote, traditional historical materialism and Althusserian-style revisionism. What is overlooked in most recent commentary and entirely ignored in modern attempts theoretically to systematize Engels' quote, intuitions is the way his letters repeatedly and emphatically underline the limitations of any general theory or model when it comes to analyzing particular historical events, processes, or societies. In the letter to Bloch, for instance, I'm trying to do the German pronunciation, Bloch, for instance, Engels concedes that he and Marx must take the blame for having laid, quote, more stress on the economic side than is due to it. We have to emphasize the main principle over and against our adversaries who denied it, end quote. I'm going to repeat that because that seems important. In the letter to Bloch, for instance, Engels concedes that he and Marx must take the blame for having laid, quote, more stress on the economic side than is due to it. We have to emphasize the main principles over and against our adversaries who denied it. Such polemical one-sidedness was pardonable, given a historiographic context dominated by philosophical idealism. Engels then goes on to argue, quote, but when it came to presenting an era of history, i.e., to making a practical application, it was a different matter, and there no error could be permitted. End quote. This echoes his complaint to Conrad Schmidt on the 5th of August of the same year, quote, our conception of history is above all a guide to study, end quote. Recall here Marx's description of his 1859 summary as a, quote, guiding thread, quote, not a lever for construction after the manner of the Hegelians. All history must be studied afresh. But instead of this, too many of the younger Germans simply make use of the phrase historical materialism, and everything can be turned into a phrase, only in order to get their own relatively scanty historical knowledge constructed into a neat system as quickly as possible. End quote. He adds sourly, quote, it often seems as if these gentlemen think anything is good enough for the workers, end quote. The, quote, phrase, accusation, also used in the letter to Bloch, has a long pedigree in Marxist invective. The same jibe figured frequently in Marx's attacks on the young Hegelians, quote, theoretical bubble blowing, end quote. Their penchant for, quote, speculative construction in the 1840s. The echo of those early critiques is instructive. These quotations amount to a general warning against a certain preemptive use of history, and a plea for empirical, and in particular for historical study. This is a more general theme in Marx's work, and not just an afterthought on the part of the aging Engels. Unfashionable as such, quote, empiricism may be in some philosophical quarters, Marxism's founders' protestation of it are too numerous and too consistent to be credibly dismissed as mere, quote, rhetoric. as Kalinikos said in 1885. In the German ideology, their first joint, quote, manifesto of the materialist conception of history, Marx and Engels argue in pretty uncompromising terms the primacy of people's, quote, materialistic connection in historical development, just as the 1859 preface does. Nevertheless, they go on to warn that, quote, definite individuals who are productively active in a definite way enter into definite social and political relations. Empirical observation must in each separate instance bring out empirically, and without any mystification and speculation, the connection of the social and political structure with production. End quote. Had Marxists taken this seriously, they could never have consistently advanced the kind of universal theory of this, quote, connection of the sort developed either by Cohen from the 1859 preface or by Althusser and Engels by Cohen from the 1859 preface or by Althusser and others from Engels' Testament. This, quote, empiricism, incidentally, is not, as some have alleged, merely an aberration of the 1840s, a, quote, positist overreaction to excesses of idealism. Marx echoes the point, for instance, over 30 years later, when repudiating Mikhailovsky's, quote, metamorphosis of the, quote, historical sketch of the crisis of the rise of capitalism in Britain, given at the end of Capital I, into, quote, an historico-philosophical theory of the general path of development prescribed by fate to all nations, end quote. One must, Marx says here, study, quote, forms of evolution separately, end quote. Something which cannot be done by using as one's master key a general historico-philosophical theory, that the supreme virtue of which consists in being super-historical, end quote. Marx. This passage, like many another in Marx, is much cited, but without due consideration for how it affects the interpretation of his methodological fundamentals. Theodore Shannon, in 1984, and his collaborators have recently shown how Marx's, quote, late writings, particularly on Russia, in fact admirably exemplify his willingness to modify and even abandon the supposed general theory of history conventionally ascribed to him in the light of fresh empirical evidence. If Engels is to be believed, it was the continuing search for such evidence which delayed completion of Volume 3 of Capital. Russian history was to play the same role there as English history had in Volume 1, given the picture of historical development normally drawn from the 1859 preface and outlined in Cohen's reading above. It is very much to the point that Marx, having learned Russian at the age of 42, and studied Russian social conditions from a mass of primary sources, envisaged Russia avoiding a, quote, capitalist stage of historical development, notwithstanding its generally low level of development of productive forces. The basis for an alternative, quote, form of evolution in Russia, in his view, lay in the specific social relations and associated forms of experience and consciousness, materialized in its surviving peasant commune, the Abstraction or Mir, providing the forces currently undermining these, state and capital, could be neutralized. Just as a side note, the Abstraction or Mir existed in some form or another until collectivization in the late 1920s and early 30s in the USSR. And what was the other thing I was thinking of? Oh, yeah. This hammer and sickle was meant to symbolize the unity of the peasants and the working class, the so-called smitchka, which was absolutely destroyed in the late 1920s and early 1930s, and should be abandoned as a symbol, because there was no that relationship between the urban working class or whatever and the rural peasantry was absolutely smashed by the people who use a symbol to claim that unity. Anyway, sorry. Shouldn't be throwing those miscellaneous statements, but I couldn't help it. Anyway, it was the writings of the, quote, great Russian scholar and, quote, and critic, Chernyshevsky, which had first alerted Marx to this possibility. Marx's historical and anthropological reading over the last decade of his life was wide-ranging and voracious. One of his last manuscripts, published in Russian translation in the 1930s, but virtually unknown among Western Marxists to this day, was a chronology of world history, from the fall of the Roman Empire to the 17th century, which runs to over 1,500 pages in print. I do not want to pull yet another, quote, unknown Marx out of the archivist's hat, but the painstakingly empirical tenor of such an enterprise is worth remarking, perhaps in the context of this argument. All this suggests that general formulations of the kind found in the 1859 preface should be treated as exactly what Marx said they were, precisely a guiding thread, an orientation to empirical and historical research, not a theoretical substitute for it. It can be questioned, in other words, whether they were ever intended to amount to a theory of history in any rigorous sense of the word at all. To take them as such, as do both Cohen and the Althusserians, is to misconstrue them. Obviously, Marx has a certain vision of the overall trajectory of human historical development, which leads him to focus on material production as his analytic starting point. But this is not quite the same thing as a systematic theory. It provides, rather, the guiding thread framework within which he works empirically. We should attend instead to Engels' repeated urgings in his late letters that those in search of the fundamentals of historical materialism should not just as Marx's general resumes, should not look just at Marx's general resumes, like the preface, but rather at his concrete analysis, his historiographic practice. 3 times Engels refers his correspondence to the 18th Brumaire as an epitome of historical materialist analysis. He also recommends that critics should look at Capital, quote, the section on the working day, for instance, where legislation, which is surely a political act, has such a drastic effect, or the section on the history of the bourgeoisie, end quote. The clear message is that the meaning of Marx's general summary pronouncements is best sought not in texts like the 1859 preface taken in isolation, but in the wider context of the substantive analyses, such as summaries can inevitably do no more than gloss. Marx's concepts are best explicated on the basis of their actual use. Now, Engels has been criticized in recent Marxist literature for both the variety and imprecision of the metaphors he employs in these late letters to conceptualize the, quote, ultimate primacy of the material dimensions of social life. Cohen's one dismissive reference to the letter to Bloch is of this ilk. Such criticisms are undoubtedly, if obviously, valid, if these letters are read as advancing a putative theoretical model of social structure or historical process. Engels' formulations, without closer specification of his key terms, ultimate, such as, quote, ultimate determination, quote, relative autonomy, are so vague as to be vacuous. Devotees of Sir Karl Popper's doctrine of the necessary falsifiability of scientific propositions would have a field day with so accommodating a theory. What historical event could possibly count as an instance neither of, quote, ultimate economic determination, end quote, nor of, quote, relative superstructural autonomy, end quote. But to argue thus may be seriously to miss the point. For if Engels' intention was not to provide such a model at all, but rather to argue precisely against the translation of Marx's, quote, guiding thread into one, the objection evaporates. His apparent lack of conceptual rigor, far from being a weakness, is of a piece with the character of the message he is trying to convey. So is Marx's own use of a base superstructure metaphor, an analogy rather than a precise concept, in the 1859 preface and elsewhere. A use which, as we shall see, is also far from consistent between texts. Such shifting and theoretically treacherous recourse to metaphor and analogy may be a linguistic signal of exactly the inappropriateness of attempting a closed and, quote, rigorous formulation of theory at this level of generality in the first place. Marx, after all, himself remarks at the start of the 1859 preface that, quote, the reader who really wishes to follow me will have to decide to advance from the particular to the general, end quote, and in that spirit offers no more in that text. In his own estimate, than, quote, a few brief remarks regarding the course of my study of political economy, end quote. But as Edward Thompson has observed, quote, the graveyard of philosophy is cluttered with grand systems which mistook analogies for concepts, end quote. Quote, traditional historical materialism, I shall argue, is just such a grand system built on just such mistakes.